Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to today's debate, Green Deal Metals in Europe, Tackling the Zero Pollution Challenge. My name's David Rose. I'll be your moderator for this 90-minute debate. I'd like to warmly welcome our 300 registered users for today's event, representing industry and its full value chain, regulators, representatives from member states, downstream users, and of course also importantly, civil society. Now, let's get started. I want to set the frame for today's debate to invite you to join me to watch a short 1-minute video just to set our frame of context for what we're going to discuss. So as we can see from the video, our key question for today is how can the Green Deal balance Europe's need for significantly more key metals with the mitigation of environmental impact to tackle the zero pollution challenge? Now let me make a few comments to get us started here, building on the video, about metals in the energy transition. We all know, and I think we all accept, that we're going to need more metals for Europe's climate, circular economy and zero pollution agenda, the Green Deal if you like. But let me quantify this with this year's IEA Critical Minerals report. And I quote, "The energy sector's overall needs for critical minerals could increase by as much as 6 times by 2040. I repeat here, 6 times, depending on how rapidly governments act, of course, to reduce emissions. Now, when we look at metals and the zero pollution ambition, it's equally clear that the Green Deal has an environmental pillar. We know about the climate pillar, we know about the circularity pillar, but there's also a key environmental pillar to consider, which is where we're going today. The European Commission this year has released its Zero Pollution Action Plan, and we also have specific policy measures in the Green Deal's environmental pillar, such as the chemical strategy and the biodiversity strategy. Now, in terms of aim, the Zero Pollution Action Plan aims not for zero, but to reduce pollution to levels that are not harmful to human health or the environment. Now, I think we can all, many of us, accept as well that the main focus in EU debate and legislation in recent years has been on climate impacts and lowering greenhouse gas emissions. But the environmental impacts of the metals value chain also pose a challenge for the metals industry. And I think the industry, and this is where we're going to be focusing today, faces a clear choice of 2 pathways. Pathway number 1, a more conservative pathway with the risk of accessibility and acceptability issues in the future, or a more ambitious pathway, mirroring the one that it's already taken on climate and deeper circularity, stepping up in the same way with the same level of ambition. But there's also an inherent tension in the Green Deal, I think many of you would accept. Coming back to that question we saw in the video, how can we balance the need for significantly more metals with the mitigation of environmental impact? Now we're going to address that today with 3 main steps. First of all, in a moment, we'll have a keynote from the Executive Director of the European Environmental Agency, Hans Bruyninckx. We'll also then go straight to reflections from current Umicore President and former Umicore CEO, Thomas Leysen. And then I'll bring Thomas and Hans together for a debate with me, fueled also by your questions as an audience. But before we hand over to Hans, I'd like to hand over to you, the audience. We have 2 poll questions for you. Well, we'd like to elicit your views on some of the key topics related to tackling the zero pollution challenge. Now, in a moment on your screens, you'll see your first poll question, and I'll give you about 30 seconds to address that question once it comes up for you, and we'll take a look together at the results. So our first question is, what are the most important action areas for Europe to reduce the environmental impacts of its metal supply? Maximising recycling rates, reduce levels of consumption, minimise air and water pollution during production, mitigate biodiversity impacts from mining, or preventing harmful exposure to metals toxicity. So I'd invite you to make your choices now, please, everybody. I think I'll give you a little countdown, ladies and gentlemen, to create a bit of tension. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And our speakers are definitely watching the screen here for our results. And let's see. So we have two clear leaders in the race for question 1 then. And I invite our panelists, also our speakers, to take note of these. So our audience feels that maximising recycling rates and also reducing levels of consumption are the two key ways, or two most important action areas for Europe to reduce the environmental impacts of its metals supply. Now let's transition rapidly on then to the second of our two poll questions for you, our audience. And our second question, which will be coming up on your screen in just a moment, is what do companies need most to reduce their environmental impacts in line with the EU's zero pollution ambition? Is it availability of finance, a level playing field with global competitors, regulatory coherence and predictability, incentives for best performers or innovators in sustainability, or realistic targets reflecting actual technical limits? So again, just take a moment to choose your answers, please. And again, we come to our countdown. I'll do a lot of countdowns today. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now much more of a mixed spread here now. So availability of finance is not getting any traction. Our clear leader is regulatory coherence and predictability with 40%. Closely followed, or relatively closely followed, by the level playing field with global competitors. And also ambitious but realistic targets. And then followed by incentives for innovators in sustainability with 10%. So thank you, audience, for your views on this, and I know our speakers, Thomas and Hans, will bear those in mind. Now, with your views in mind then as expressed in the poll, I'd like to move on without further ado to our keynote. So it gives me great pleasure and a virtual round of applause from our audience for our keynote speaker, who will set the frame for our debate today, the Executive Director of the European Environmental Agency, Hans Bruyninckx. Over to you, Hans.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to be present in this Eurometaux event. I will illustrate to you with a brief keynote presentation what the challenge is for the European economy and the global economy, for that matter, in transitioning to a low-carbon circular economy that respects also biodiversity limits and is in line with human health. And that is in essence what the Green Deal is about. And if we want to understand the challenge, I think we first need to look at where the global economy has moved over the last 50 years. And on the red arrow, you see the growth in economic output in line with population growth, and that also includes an increased use of materials, energy, fertilizer, water, resources in general. On the blue side, you see the impact on the planet, on ecosystems, on climate. You see, in other words, the externalities, as we call it, of our current model of production and consumption. And it is that we need to address. Now, if you look at the sector of non-ferrous metals, you see a rather similar evolution of the use of resources. If we translate that in the context that is the boundary condition for the economy of the future and for any engagement with that economy as an economic sector, we focus on four elements. One is illustrated by the work of the IPCC, the Panel on Climate Change, and that is the climate challenge. The second one is probably lesser known. It's a similar panel, IPBES, on ecosystems and the services they deliver to society. Lesser known is the International Resource Panel, although I think and hope that in this context it is more known, and it looks at resource use and the impact on society, on the planet, on our health, and of course also the link to human health, where the World Health Organization is operating. And if you look at those challenges and the messages coming from science, they all give a similar view. One, we are living in times of urgency to deal with a number of these issues. Windows of opportunity to deal with them are closing, so we speak about a pivotal decade. Secondly, we are talking about irreversibilities. Think of climate change, where climate is changing. That is very difficult to reverse. The same is true with biodiversity loss. We're also living in times of tipping points in the system, which makes things more complex, less predictable, and we live in times of risk, as we say it. And all of these things are interconnected. I would also say they are interconnected when it comes to dealing with your sector. Climate change, biodiversity, resource use, and human health are all challenges that you need to deal with. They are embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals, but also in the European Green Deal, in its targets for net zero emissions, zero pollution, strong biodiversity, and circular economy. Yeah? Now, to start with circular economy, one of the critical elements that we look at is resource efficiency. And if we look at the last 20 years, we see a marked increase in resource efficiency. In other words, our economy produces more output, more wealth, based on relatively fewer resources. Now, that doesn't mean that we have become more circular at the same rate, because if we look at the evolution of circularity in Europe, overall we see a very slow increase over the last 15 to 20 years. We're up to about 12% circularity. Now, it's fair to say that the metals industry is contributing more to circularity because it has a recycling rate that is significantly higher than other parts of the economy. But even there, overall, we see a rather flat line and not what you would expect in terms of circularity, a steep increase. Going then towards the pollution side, if we look at air pollution, and we focus on three essential elements in the European Environment Agency. One is heavy metals pollution, where the non-ferrous metals, if we adjust to toxicity for humans, represent about 10% of the overall toxicity. If we look at greenhouse gas emissions, we are talking about 0.4% contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, you might say that that is insignificant. Why should we focus on that? Just to give you an idea, that is about the same as the Dutch emissions in a global perspective, or if you look at the Austrian and the Swiss emissions combined. So it is significant to tackle that problem at all. And if you look at sulfur oxides, we are also dealing about a rather small contribution compared to some other parts of the industry. Now, what is, of course, important is to look at evolution. And if you look at air emissions from non-ferrous metals, we see a evolution over the last 2 decades that is in the positive direction. And that is, of course, driven by regulation and then the innovation that is stimulated by that regulation. It is clear that there are serious and significant improvements overall, where we have still a sort of, less clear trajectory is on some of the heavy metals in air pollution, where there is still quite a bit of work. Yeah? Then moving to water pollution from non-ferrous metals, it is clear that we also here see significant improvement that is driven by legislation. At the same time, it is clear that this type of legislation was necessary because heavy metals are a significant contributor historically to serious water pollution. All of this is, of course, as you know better than I do, embedded in the environmental permits that have limits for a number of the metals, and that should be based on best available technology. And as we know, best available technology is not fixed. It is a continuously moving target as we have innovation in emission abatement technology continuously. Two elements of concern are, of course, lead and mercury. There is a long history there, and they are of concern because they are persistent and they accumulate with significant impacts on human health and on the environment, especially in young people and the development of, for example, brain capacity, but also other elements of their functioning. They are also classified as possible carcinogens, and they can play on the reproductive system. So continued attention for those two is not without reason. Now, if we look at the overall regulatory context, it is clear that the focus is on the permitting regimes, and that is linked to the Industrial Emissions Directive. Integrated permits that capture the whole set of emissions is clearly, I think, a move forward in the right direction. But if we look at the future and we look at the high ambitions of the European agenda, it is clear that the Industrial Emissions Directive had to be part of the review process to bring our industry in line with those ambitions. And that means stepping up ambitions towards zero pollution, and I'll speak about that a bit later. Reinforce the decarbonization and circular economy dimension. This is about this 0.4% overall contribution, but also in reinforcing circularity. Focus on faster uptake of innovation. We are in a period where we need to speed up and scale up solutions, and of course we need to keep focusing in some cases also on end-of-the-pipe solutions. If we look at circularity and we look at the metals sector and non-ferrous metals, it is clear that quite a bit of virgin input is still needed in the sector. So thinking about the complete value chain and its impacts on environment and climate, but also on the human dimension, remains important. Quite a bit then ends up in what we call a stock of goods, where we use non-ferrous metals. Of that, a part is recycled, but that part, and that is the goal of the circular economy targets, should increase. You can also slow down the rate of the circle by moving up in what is called the R strategies, where we remanufacture goods, we repair goods, we reuse goods, and that of course will slow down a cycle of material use that is expected to increase anyway. And that is also one of the upstreaming measures that is increasingly focused on in the circular economy package. It was already mentioned in the introduction, but there is of course also a link with what I call the fundamentals of our economic system, and that is in the end the materials that we use, produce, and then integrate in products and services that we need. And the chemical strategy is based on the principle of safe and sustainable by design. And that, I think, will be a serious challenge for the chemicals industry, but also for industries that have a close alignment with parts of the chemicals industry, and that of course includes the non-ferrous metals. This is of course not a Mendeleev table. It's a table that talks about sustainable chemistry that is made by one of the fathers of what is called green chemistry, Paul Anastas, and his contributors. So I welcome you to look at this in more detail. Now moving more into the economics of it. In general, we have invested over the last decades primarily in making the systems that we already have a bit more efficient than they were before, marginal efficiency gains. Now economists will say that marginal efficiency gains are increasingly expensive, Engineers will say that they are increasingly difficult, and people who think of fundamental transitions will say that they will never get you to where you have to be. Because if we want to be on the green line contributing to investments in low carbon futures, we need to move to investments that are fundamentally sustainable and not just marginal efficiency gains. Now, the non-ferrous metals are part of those solutions, and we see that reflected in the sustainable finance strategy, but also in a number of other elements in the European financial system. Making that transition will not be so easy. We know that. And the easy line is always the green line. We tend to focus on that because we are intrinsically optimistic. We experiment with new solutions, we upscale them, and we hope to end up in a more stable, sustainable system. Where I think we are failing to pay enough attention is on what we should be phasing out, what we should leave behind, what we should no longer be doing. And why do we not do that? Well, part of it is because people defend the old position because that is where their business is, or where return on past investments is rather easy. And we also know that that's where maybe potential conflicts are. Am I going to lose my job or not? Am I going to lose my investment or not? But that is where we will need to come with enabling conditions. And that is what policy can do. And that is also what a proactive understanding of that red arrow can bring. And what are we talking about here? Well, if we look at phasing out, it is clear that we should try to focus on less energy, fossil fuel energy use. We should try to decrease the dependency on virgin materials, and we should try to phase out all technologies which do no longer comply with current ambitions. Now, those current ambitions will create more opportunities, not only for the non-ferrous metals to be part of the technologies that we need. It will also create over time more waste, whether it is in the energy part, wind energy, photovoltaics, or in other energy solutions like batteries. So we expect a large waste flow. And without going into details, of course, we count also on the sector to be recuperating those metals in a sustainable way and keep them in the value chain and the physical materials that we will need in the future. If we do that, and I am near the end of my presentation, we will also contribute further to eliminating pollution. And the zero pollution strategy and ambition is there because it plays a significant role in the climate agenda, the biodiversity agenda, and the human health agenda. And it pushes our society, and that includes industry, in the direction of investing in that type of long-term perspective. And I think the non-ferrous metals can play a significant role in showing that you are not only part of the technologies that we will require for the future, but also part of sustainable transitioning to those technologies. I will leave it at that. I'm looking forward to the discussion and the debate, and happy to engage with you in any questions that would be out there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hans. And again, a virtual round of applause, I think, from our audience for your very informative keynote to help frame discussions here. I pick up particularly on the points you made towards the end, where you mentioned that you see the non-ferrous metals industry, or metals, as being part of that sustainable transition, but also recognizing the key role that policy plays in that disruptive zone of transition that you highlighted. So I'd like to come straight across to you, Thomas, for your initial reflections on what you've heard from Hans. Obviously, bringing your vast experience from the industry perspective, I'd like to pose you two questions. The first of which is, you've heard obviously what Hans has laid out, but what key areas do you see from the industry perspective that Europe's metals companies need action? And what key areas of action are needed from metals companies to address these strong environmental expectations that Hans has outlined?
Well, industry needs to take action and is taking action on on many fronts. I mean, there's many. If you break down the challenges and the issues that Hans outlined, I mean, to address these, it's there's not a silver bullet. There's not a single action that needs to be taken. Many actions need to be taken, and indeed, companies are working on many fronts to address them. So, if you talk about key actions, I mean, first of all, clearly climate and CO2 or greenhouse gas reduction is absolutely crucial. It's an area where the companies are doing a lot and still need to do a lot to move towards net zero. I think very important to highlight energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is something that we need to continue to work at. We are in energy intensive industry. Certainly a lot of the metals refining, processing are very energy intensive, and so we need to continue to invest in that. Decarbonizing the production processes certainly is another area. Some of these production processes require today carbon-related products, whether it's cokes or whether it's others in the production process. We will need to move towards alternatives there to eliminate the emissions. Obviously, switching to green energy is crucial. We'll probably come back to that. There's many other areas where the industry needs to take action, is taking action. We need to invest in further innovation to continue to ensure that there are sustainable uses for byproducts, slags, mine tailings and things like that. These are inevitable byproducts of metallurgical processes or for mining processes, and it is desirable that we find use cases that are sustainable, that continue to be sustainable, that are even more sustainable than they are today. So these are important areas. Recycling, we'll touch upon that, I'm sure, later on as well. I mean, there's a huge challenge in designing a recycling ecosystem for EV batteries. This is going to be a huge area, and this is not without technological challenges. I'm sure they will be able to be overcome, but there are still a lot of work to be done there. So many areas where the industry is crucial in having to find solutions.
Okay, indeed, and as you mentioned, we'll delve into all of those key areas of primary and secondary supply, circular economy, and also sustainable financing as we progress in our debate. So from your side, also from the business perspective, we've heard from Hans, obviously, a clear framework there in terms of policy, in terms of targets and ambition. But from your side, Thomas, what are the primary business realities or constraints that you feel regulators and policymakers need to be aware of, in broad terms, because obviously we'll delve deeper into those?
Yeah. Well, I think one that is very important that I'd like to, which is really worrying me to a certain extent, is a lot of these roadmaps that industry is now announcing towards net zero is predicated on having enough green electricity. And so, if you see in all these targets that's being announced of CO2 emission reduction of 20%, 50% net zero, Umicore has announced a net zero target for 2035 with intermediary targets for 2025 and 2030. A significant part of that will have to come from green energy supply. And I'm really a bit worried, I have to say, about the availability of green energy. And we don't even need to talk about the availability in China or in other parts of the world where it's certainly an issue, but also in Europe there's going to be such a massive need, and so the speed of scaling up the green energy, green electricity production is something that I'm really a bit concerned whether this will be able to follow. This has to do with not so much with the incentives, because the incentives are clearly there, because everyone is clamoring preparing for it, will need it to reach its target. But there is a whole issue of permitting. I think that's probably the most challenging issue. I mean, nobody really wants windmills in their backyard. I understand. I mean, if they announced there would be a windmill in my backyard, I probably wouldn't be so enthusiastic. I live in the city, so the risk is limited. But so I understand the issues associated with it. But if we don't solve that, and if we don't scale up massively green electricity production at a rate which is higher than what we've seen so far, and then we really will.
Okay, so primary issue from your side, as you've noted, is that you're worried about, it's a concern, is the availability of the necessary quantities of green electricity in the right time frame, and also that critical issue that always comes down to implementation of not in my backyard, which is a practical issue, of course, a societal issue to address. Is there a second element as well where perhaps you feel it's a business reality or constraint that you see from your experience that is something that Hans and regulators, policymakers also need to be very aware of?
Yeah, I think there's one is that certainly in our type of industry, certain innovations and certain process changes take time. I mean, metallurgical processes are, I think typically if you look at metallurgical processes, innovation from the stage of ideation to lab scale experimentation, building a small scale pilot, building a larger scale pilot to industrial implementation. These are processes that sometimes take 10 to 20 years.
So am I right in understanding then, in the point you raised, that you're concerned that the timeframes being proposed don't facilitate that type of evolution that's needed?
Well, what I'm saying is regulators need to be aware that in certain cases these changes take time, and sometimes it's recognized, sometimes it's not. But if you ask me, what do regulators need to be aware of, is that in certain cases this doesn't go quite as fast, certainly in very large-scale industrial processes like metallurgical processes. I think another point is indeed that we are operating obviously in an international context. So whilst I'm the first one to recognize the role of regulation to drive innovation, to push the boundaries, to set new constraints, to spur innovation, and to create a level playing field, certainly within Europe as well. We live in an international context, and so I think that that has to be recognized as well. That I think the industry can live with a degree of first mover costs, which come also with first mover advantages. But there's a limit to how much is viable in an international context. And so I think it is really important, and I think that was also what came out of the question that you put: clear and coherent regulatory framework that is predictable, that allows investments to take place. Yeah, I think
it's an enabling framework almost for that. Well, Hans, let me throw those straight back to you then. So, concerns or worried, to quote Thomas specifically, about the green electricity, the time frame concept of obviously the practical need to evolve process relative to timeframes in policy making, and also that wider international context to recognise that when we look specifically also at the Zero Pollution Challenge, Europe's not operating in a vacuum, obviously, and is operating, as many companies in the field do, in a global playing field. Could I ask you to just broadly address those 3 points before we dig deeper?
Yeah, I'd like to start with the one on predictability, because it also came out in the poll as the number one element, regulatory coherence and predictability. I think that is exactly where Europe with the Green Deal has made a major step forward. It is an interconnected set of targets. If you look at the circular economy target, it refers to biodiversity, it refers to the climate objectives, it refers to health. They all refer to each other, so there is coherency there. There is also a planning that goes to 25 to 2030, in some cases to 2040 and 2050. So the long-term direction of travel is made very clear. It is also translated in targets that mostly have a 10-year and beyond trajectory that is based on what is called impact assessments, and they take into account the the economic situation and the trend lines that are there and the sort of evolution of technological breakthroughs. Yeah? So I think in that sense Europe has made a significant step forward, and most of that is of course discussed with the sector organizations in Brussels, and that's why they are all there as well to interact with the policymakers. When it comes to the energy element, of course, electrification of our economy is the sort of key also to drive part of that agenda, not only the climate agenda. We have to speed up the decarbonization of our economy by a factor 2.5 to 3 to stay in line with net zero emissions by 2050. So it is true indeed that we will need to speed up investments. Now, the advantage is that by now renewables are market competitive. In fact, in quite a number of countries, we have locked ourselves into other technologies that are already now more expensive than renewables without subsidies. The NIMBY perspective, not in my backyard, has in some cases evolved into the NIABI, not in anybody's backyard, which is why in some cases we are lucky to have a huge backyard called the North Sea, for example, and we are now working on concepts of interconnected wind farms on the North Sea. Belgium is also investing in a connection with Denmark for the next decade. You've got similar evolutions in the Baltic Sea and in the Ostsee. So we start to work on those solutions. Also solar, especially around the Mediterranean, is market competitive and is used increasingly. But it remains a challenge to get the investments and the infrastructure going. Now, this is to the advantage of the non-ferrous metals, because all of those solutions will include quite a bit of non-ferrous metals. The international context, the Green Deal is clear. It states that Europe should lead the transition. So it places Europe in the lead. Yeah? And that is because we have the targets, the policy, we also have the technology and the knowledge institutions that can put us in a first mover advantage. What is new in the Green Deal is that Europe is thinking of a protective layer around Europe's industry, for example, through a carbon border adjustment tax, also by protecting parts of our industry from imports that are not living up to certain standards, by product norms, but also by process norms. REACH also already included that partially. So I think the elements are there. It's a matter of indeed setting ambitious targets. Why? There is no option. There is no other option given the global context. But ambitious targets that bring people along. We need to organize a race to the top, yeah? Okay. With Europe being the top. I think that is in the end what we are aiming for.
Okay, so the concept is a race to the top. Let's dig deeper now then, as we want to in our debate. And let's broach three broad topics that we brought in with our video at the beginning and my opening comments as well. So looking at circularity, looking also at environmental impacts from primary supply, and also looking at financing and sustainable finance. Now I want to broach these one by one, and in each of these, audience, I'll ask you also to use the question field underneath your view screen that you have logged in to send questions to me that I can also pose to our speakers on your behalf. So we're going to take about 15 minutes or so with each one of these three areas, one by one, and I'll open up at the end of each area for you, the audience, to pose some questions to our speakers, which I'll try my best to summarize and represent the most common question areas for you. So let's take the first one then, building on what we've said so far already, and looking at the idea of higher and deeper levels of circularity. Now, we've talked a little about this idea about, ambitious targets, about the need for the right framework conditions. So let's focus in now on this tackling the zero pollution challenge, and let's look at this issue of how can we reach higher and deeper levels of circularity for metals in Europe as part of the long-term solution. You mentioned, Hans, that the need for circularity is clearly there. So Thomas, I'll pose this to you first. From your side, how can we practically move towards this need for much higher and deeper levels of circularity of metals as we move forward?
Again, it's a issue that has many facets, but one of the biggest challenges to effective circularity today is remains the collection of the waste or of the end-of-life materials where there's a widely dispersive use. Classic example of that is mobile phones. They can be perfectly recycled. We do that here in Hoboken, very close by to where we sit. But the challenge here is not the technological challenge of treating these batteries, of recycling these mobile phones at the end of their life, both the phones and the batteries. But even though there may be some challenges there, I'll come to as well. But the biggest challenge is collecting them. We all know that studies time and again show that maybe 5 to maybe a slightly more percent of these phones only get collected. Because what happens, people normally when they discard their phone, they leave it in a drawer. They don't return it. They maybe after a couple of years they clear out their
Indeed, if I can come in, Thomas, I'll have to say I remember, in fact, someone from Eurometaux about 4 years ago in Brussels when we were discussing the whole issue of zero pollution agenda, when it was in its more formulative stage at that point, holding up a bag, I think 7 or 8 mobile phones in it, saying these were in my drawer.
Yeah. Well,
raise a hand in the audience if you have the same. And I think we'd all raise our hands, audience watching us as well. So, okay, that's the issue. But here I want to, clearly we define issue, but let's also propose solution. So if we have an issue that collection is not as effective as it needs to be, what's your solution to this practice?
Well, I guess the biggest single solution there is extended producer responsibility, that there is systems in place where there is actually a financial incentive for people to return them to the shop or when they buy. Obviously, awareness raising and actions vis-à-vis the general public are important as well. But I think you need to think about systems like that.
Yeah, and Hans, what would be your take on that?
Yeah, I agree with that. You need a recycling system.
Yeah.
And not only a facility to recycle, you need a recycling system, and that includes incentives for people to engage with that. They can be financial, they can be producer responsibility, they could be fundamental discussions about the ownership of the materials. And when you buy something, you become the owner.
Yeah.
Well, you could also imagine that the materials remain the ownership of those who have produced the materials. And so there's all sorts of thinking around that. Before that, I think there's also the design step, and the circular economy package is focusing also a lot of the upstream measures, and that's where design comes in. Because depending on how products are designed, they become much more easy to keep in a circular economy logic, to take them apart, to recycle. That's where quite a bit of attention is. And I think what often the industry actors focus on is also the markets for secondary materials. It's often easier to go to virgin materials than to go to secondary materials. So we should make sure that secondary materials are at least on par when it comes to keeping them in the cycle. And that has to do with legislation, it has to do with financial incentives, it has to do with environmental regulation and expectations, efficiency targets, all of those elements. So
indeed, well, clearly, when we're looking at reducing environmental footprint of this substantially higher demand for metals as we move towards the digital and energy transition, it's clear that secondary sourcing is going to play a key role. And in fact, Ester, one of our speakers that was going to be with us but unfortunately couldn't join us today due to illness, thankfully not COVID, I can underline though. In fact, I know her research is very strong in that area in looking at the value of secondary supply. So we've mentioned this idea then of optimizing the recycling ecosystem and also the crucial need, Hans, for improving design and use of products and product innovation. But my question to both of you would be, are the current frameworks in place up to standard for that? You're saying we need the right incentives and you're saying that we need the right ecosystem for recycling, but do we have it right now? And if we don't, are we going to have it in time? And if so, how?
Well, first, to come back to a few things that Hans said, I think that's the issue about the acceptability of secondary materials. That's the beauty of metals. They are infinitely recyclable, and they are recyclable without quality loss. Actually, very often recycled metals are even more pure than the primary supply, so you don't have the phenomenon of downcycling that you have in other materials like plastics or paper. So that's a fantastic property and
like
strength.
An experienced panel that gets better with age. Yes.
Yeah, well, you could say that. So that's a unique strength of metals. So that let's celebrate that, or let's at least acknowledge that. I fully agree that the design for recyclability is a very important issue. Actually, because there's often a circularity paradox, in the sense that certain product innovations which are enhance user experience or practicality in a first use make recycling more complex. Take the example of integrated batteries in mobile phones. If you can't take them out, it becomes a bigger challenge to recycle them, because there are very different metal combinations in the batteries and in the mobile phone itself. So we actually, as it happens, yesterday Umicore was part of an international call for what we call removable, replaceable and repairable batteries, which isn't quite the case today. And so if we don't move towards that direction, we'll have much bigger challenges in having effective recycling and cost-effective recycling. So these things need to be thought through from the beginning, and product regulation also needs to take this design for recyclability into account.
Yeah. And from your side, is it already taking that into account well, or is there scope for that to be further improved?
Well, there's certainly scope for that to be further improved. I mean, that's why we made this call also yesterday as part of a very broad alliance of players in the industry, because we really see that as a challenge, and there are some practical recommendations how to go about it. More work needs to be done.
More work needs to be done. And Hans, from your side?
Well, it's clear that we're not there. We are moving really slowly in the direction of a circular economy. We've seen the trend line, it's really slow. We really need to see that bend in the curve to speed up and scale up those solutions. Part of that, of course, has to do with the essential element that we do not include the full cost of the resources that we use in the price. Those are the so-called externalities, the environmental cost, the climate cost, and the International Resource Panel has done quite a bit of work on the fact that we will never get to climate neutrality nor to biodiversity targets if we don't go to circular economy and very strong resource efficiency. Because we need to decouple the impact of that use, and that means that financial incentives, clear price mechanisms, in addition to targets, will need to be there. It's a fantasy to think that we will be climate neutral in 2050 without a much stronger circular economy. There is too much carbon embedded into the material cycle that we have today. So the push for the type of solutions that we know are out there and that we know are possible needs to come from clear market incentives and clear regulatory contexts that show us where the winners will be. And the obvious winner needs to be society in the end, because we are living in a context that is not going in the right direction when it comes to climate and biodiversity and other elements that I mentioned.
Okay. Another area I think that's often, I won't say overlooked, but requires attention as well when we're talking about creating the right circular ecosystem or deeper circular economy, and the challenges we've already identified in scaling that up and making that faster, is also the low volume technology metals. We can obviously, within metals being a very broad area, as you know better than me, Thomas, we've also got the lower volume technology metals, which will be also in very high demand, which, if I understand correctly, and I believe I do, are also a great challenge when it comes to circular economy, because ultimately the opportunity and the facility to feasibly recycle those is lacking at the moment. Is that the case?
Well, it depends. I mean, some, depending what you call low volume metals, but if you take a metal like cobalt, that in many of its use cases, certainly in batteries, can be effectively recycled. There's other elements like rare earths or even lithium, which is that's certainly not a low volume one. That is more challenging to recover effectively and economically. So it's not always related to the actual volume, but certainly there may be challenges. So I mean, there's a huge need for further innovation, because certainly some of these low volume metals, take the battery industry as one example, but that's one which is growing, where metals use is going to grow fastest in the coming decades, and Hans has shown that in his slides as well. If we don't design effective recycling systems, we just won't have the primary supply. The Earth's crust is not going to give it. It's not there. Cobalt is an example, but there's others. So yeah, there's a huge role for innovation there. I'm relatively confident that innovation will come and we'll find it, but we need to acknowledge that in many cases there's still not lots of work to be done. But again, I mean, that is what the industry can do itself, but there is this the whole value chain that needs to be thought through, and certainly in terms of making recycling possible, there is things that will have to be included at the design step. There's the whole ecosystem for recovery, for collection, etc., that is to be designed to be as effective and as efficient as possible.
Indeed. So consensus I see then on obviously the crucial role of secondary raw materials or secondary materials in achieving the right level of circularity. An acknowledgement from both sides that we also need to move forward and up the pace of developing that circular economy, and that action is still needed in that area. Now, with those points in mind, I'd like to go to our audience now and bring up some questions which we can see on our screen that we've selected to represent what our audience is asking. And I'll invite you both to comment on those to bring this first cycle of debate to an end. So our questions: what's needed now for Europe to prepare its recycling industry for the batteries, wind and solar panels scrap only available from 2030? Clearly there's going to be a large quantity of end of life coming in those areas. Second question: how can we mainstream consumer behaviour for taking care of the full life cycle of their goods? I think bringing in the consumer angle is key there. And how can Europe take responsibility for the environmental impacts of its waste exports? And again, let's recognise that we do export a quantity of our waste. So I'll take the first question and I'll open it up to both of you, whoever wants to come in, Hans or Thomas, on that.
I think the first question is obviously for Thomas, because you're at the center of that type of technology.
Certainly, I mean, Umicore is more involved in the battery side of that equation rather than wind and solar panels scrap for the time being. Well, I think we need to make sure that that is our responsibility as Umicore and some other companies in that space, that we design the processes. The challenge is less with the metallurgy than the safe handling of these batteries, these car batteries, because they have a much bigger size. They're big monolithic blocks, and that poses safety challenges. You don't want, while handling them to catch fire, for example. But that at the same time is something that falls on us, but also on the whole chain. So we will need to work together with the battery manufacturers, again, not to belabor the point, to design these batteries so that they can be effectively recycled. We will need a large cooperation across the value chain with car manufacturers, with battery manufacturers, with logistical companies, with metallurgical companies that will do the actual, or recycling companies that will do the actual recycling. And the good thing is that we have a number of years to prepare for that, because today there's limited quantities obviously available. There's some production scrap that needs to be treated. There's very little end of life, because luckily these batteries have a long lasting life, possibly a second life. And what we're actually finding is that this life is probably longer than many people anticipated earlier. So we have some time to prepare, but we absolutely need to prepare, because also just from a availability of the molecules, we will need to design this circular model, let alone for reasons of avoiding the waste streams, but even for just making this system function it is crucial. So yeah, a lot of work across the supply chain. There are initiatives that are going on. Today we are still in a phase where there's many players who are working on this. I think there will probably need to evolve into some sort of consortia to make this efficient, but a lot of work there to be done. So, and a lot of cooperation across industry actors.
Yeah, so it needs a whole value chain approach, but you see a clear opportunity, if I understand correctly, then, that preparing that and getting ready for those waste streams we know are coming in that more coordinated whole value chain way with a consortia, for example, would be the effective solution. Hans?
Yeah, just a little bit on wind and solar. I think, again, we know that this waste stream is coming. So we can prepare for it. That's one thing. We can also prepare in terms of setting targets and regulation for that, which until now has hardly been the case. We also, I think, need to get rid of some of the urban legends around that.
Such as?
The urban legend that solar panels and windmills are unrecyclable, that is not true. Do we need technological innovation there? Yes. Can we improve the design? Yes. Can we work throughout the value chain with responsibility schemes? Yes, of course. But I think we would be helped by actively dishing some of these urban legends or cowboy stories and focusing on the innovation that we need in the sector. And it's not easy in some cases, but it's doable. There are some good projects funded by the EU, amongst other funders, to deal with that.
So, linking with what Thomas said, then we need a whole value chain approach, we need a coordinated approach, and we need an evidence-based approach as well, with forward-looking legislation put in place for future need, for an issue, as you said, that's predictable, that we can see coming. Okay, let's move on to our second question then, about mainstreaming consumer behaviour for taking care of the life cycle of goods. Hans, do you want to pick that up?
Yes, behaviour doesn't fall from the sky. That I think is a start of answering the question. Some people are intrinsically motivated to do the right things when it comes to this type of behaviour. I think increasingly we see younger people that have that sort of intrinsic motivation because they are concerned about their future or they learn about it. But at the end of the day, we're also motivated by price signals. So if you want to engage the consumer and change consumer behavior, we need to set up systems that give them an incentive to bring back these old phones that are now in a drawer, to buy the type of products that have a longer life cycle and are repairable, because they are the price efficient products to buy, and we need to give them information. Information that allows them to make choices if they want to make that choice. We see that with consumer goods like refrigerators. We increasingly see it on food that has a simple labeling. We can also do that for circularity principles. How big is the resource efficiency potential of this good? So if you bring information to incentives together in a system of provisioning, as we call that, then you bring the right choices to where consumers make choices, then I think we can really engage with people in that way.
Yeah, so a combination of a clear and informative and standardized system of labeling to inform consumers, allied also with incentives for adoption of certain types of products which lead towards the sort of decarbonized future and circular economy and lower environmental impact that we're all looking for. Thomas, any comments on that?
No, I mean, I very much agree with that. I mean, some of these waste streams will sort of find their way automatically towards recycling. car batteries, I think the issue will not be their collection or consumer behavior. There will be that will be taken care of. They won't be kept in your drawers.
Unlikely.
In other cases, like electronic scrap, I mean, the WEEE regulation that Europe introduced a number of years ago was instrumental in driving recycling rates of electronic scrap. So in certain cases, it is well-designed regulation. It is indeed providing the financial incentives. It could be through extended producer responsibility. So it has to be looked at segment by segment, what is going to be the most effective, because we can't wait till everyone has the intrinsic motivation. I mean, that will hopefully come one day, and I can see that indeed the younger generation is much more into that. But
but it's very much an end point to be reached rather than something to hope for.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Thanks. And let's broach that third question before we move on to our next topic. Then, how can Europe take responsibility for the environmental impacts of its waste exports? And obviously here they're citing the waste shipments regulation. Hans, do you want to pick that up?
Well, first of all, I think by recognizing responsibility for the negative consequences of that, and we know that from electronic waste. I mean, we've all seen the images of these almost informal ateliers of people in horrific conditions, or waste just piling up, or that should be banned, to be quite frank. I mean, there is no space for that in any concept of global sustainability. That is clear. Secondly, I think increasingly developing countries are saying, no, we don't want your waste, which is what happened with China and a number of other countries on plastic waste. But thirdly, and more fundamentally, I think we need to stop thinking that we are exporting waste. We're exporting materials. Yeah. And that is where I think the real shift in thinking and in organizing ourselves should be. If you go to a circular economy model, you have to shift from waste thinking to materials thinking. And who in their right mind would be exporting materials if they have an economic value in the cycle? So it's again the setting of incentives that makes us look at these shipments in a very different way.
And indeed, we could also say exporting materials that we have a strategic need in terms of supply and future supply as well.
Yeah. Okay. No, and certainly, and where we have the capability to treat them ourselves. But so I think, yes, I mean, we've certainly made major steps in that, the Basel regulations, the Basel directives in the first instance. But I think there's the role of bans, but there's also the enforcement of that is also an issue sometimes. We still see, I'm not sure whether we see it still today, but in recent years where cars were exported, which they may be, but then they were stuffed full in the trunks with electronic waste, which was hidden, which went then to Africa as well, and there to be treated in horrific conditions. So I think there's also a role for enforcement, which I just would like to add to what Hans said.
Yeah, so a need to strengthen enforcement, which in the past has not been as robust as it could have been, perhaps. Okay, well, with those in mind then, and thanks to our audience for those questions, and keep them coming for the other topics, keeping an eye on time and progress, I'm going to transition to our second issue now, about mitigating environmental impacts from primary metals supply. And we've talked about secondary in terms of a deeper circular economy, and Hans, you underlined its key value, and Thomas, you echoed some points on that. But let's move now to the primary concept. So my question is a broad one in a sense, and it is a broad one, but how can we mitigate environmental impacts from the primary metals supply that we all acknowledge we're going to need in larger quantities as we move forward? And again, audience, I invite you to send in your questions on this particular area. And as before, I'll do my best to bring up some of those and pose them to our panel before we move on to our third and final topic. So open up to both of you on the mitigating impacts from primary supply. Perhaps, Thomas, you want to pick that up first?
Well, certainly primary supply, if you're talking about primary supply in Europe, Europe will never have the biggest mining industry in the world because geology dictates that. But Europe has a role to play also in primary supply, especially also relating to to the need for battery materials. I mean, there's some nickel mining projects in Scandinavia, in Finland. There's lithium being proposed in Serbia, etc. So Europe will continue to have a primary metals production as well. And again, I think there we have to really also drive and think through the innovation potential further. It is a very old industry, mining. It's been around for thousands of years, but innovation can still play a role. I think there are examples of innovative techniques, bioleaching techniques, for example, in nickel recovery. There's now innovation around extraction of lithium from geothermal energy.
So the innovation potential is clearly there. But is there a risk in this area as well that because Europe is very heavily dependent on imports, and let's be frank, imports from areas of the world with lower environmental standards, do we not face a tangible risk that if there's not sufficient support for that type of innovation that you're giving examples of, that the easy go-to solution is just to rely on imports?
Well, in any case, I think in hardly any of these metals, Europe will be self-sufficient. So there will always be a need for imports unless we can come to a steady state of circularity, which, for example, for batteries, in 40, 50 years may well be the case, but certainly not in the intervening period as we ramp up, and there will be need for primary virgin input in a very important, not to say massive amounts for the battery materials, and so part of that can come from primary suppliers in Europe, and part will need to be imported. No, what we have there to ensure is the transparency on the chain, and I think also for actors in the chain to take responsibility for the soundness of the processes that are used throughout the chain. I think in the battery industry there's many initiatives around that are going on. Take the Global Battery Alliance that a number of people in the chain, and including Umicore, are setting up about creating a battery passport which tracks the materials from the mine to the EV, to the battery production, EV production, recycling, end of life, etc., to give transparency where these metals come from and how they need to be looked at. There's in the automotive industry, you have this initiative Catena-X, which is trying to give transparency about the whole supply chain. So yeah, I think that is part of it as well, and I think that it takes also actors downstream from the metals producers to take not only to pay lip service to the integrity of their supply chain, but to take actual actions. I think it's not a secret. Umicore has a very strict policy on no child labor in their cobalt, in the cobalt that we source from Congo. We source from Congo, but we have a very strict policy around that with audits, etc. Nevertheless, there is a lot of unethically mined cobalt in the Congo. It still ends up somewhere in the whole chain.
Indeed, to have that real supply chain transparency is a challenge in practical reality, isn't it?
And I think a lot of maybe battery manufacturers pay lip service to the fact that they don't want that, but they do not always act in full consequence of those statements, and so that needs to change further, and that's why initiatives like the ones we're taking are important.
Yeah.
I think it's a critical element. I think we can be open that on the fact that the mining industry does not have the best stellar track record on sustainability. And we know from analyses in the International Resource Panel, but a couple decades of research that the early stages of our resource use, where we source the resources, has a really significant impact on environmental consequences, biodiversity, that often goes beyond the very local scale. It can be complete regions, river systems that are affected. We also know that greenhouse gas emissions in those early stages can be quite significant, because also that is a very energy intensive stage in many cases, and not exactly in the best circumstances in many places. And then of course there are the health and human rights impacts of that, even in cases where it's not about blatant cases of almost slavery and child labor. Those stages are important, and if we don't address those also with best available technology, but also best available governance approaches that include taking local populations and regions seriously in that, I think we cannot speak about sustainable resource use. So there is that ethical responsibility part, but also hardcore data shows that if we don't address that stage more fundamentally, we will again not decouple our resource use from the impacts on climate and biodiversity. And that in the end is one of the goals of sustainable resource use and circularity.
Indeed. So what do you see then in practical terms? We've heard already from Thomas about the need, for example, for going beyond perhaps what he termed lip service and really having a much more a stronger focus throughout the value chain on supply chain transparency, for example. What would be your solution in dealing with what is a clear issue? It's there and it's been there historically. So how do we best deal with that?
Well, material passports of serious transparency that are auditable is definitely, as Thomas said, one of the steps forward, and we see that in parts of the resource industry. We had the Kimberley process on diamonds. We had the batteries initiative. I mean, we see a number of those elements. Second, I think there is also a political dimension to that. Many of the serious issues that are there are not emerging in the strongest open, transparent, democratic regions, but are emerging in regions where governance is done on a different basis. And that for me is a question of taking responsibility, and people are even talking in some cases of extending legal responsibility for that. Lawyers are thinking in that direction. A third element for me is that most of the regulation that we make is linked to territory. It's based on the concept of sovereignty. Whereas we know that the global economy is easily hopping from boundary to boundary, we talk in value chains. So regulation that is, or governance systems that are much closer linked to the real global value chains is clearly one of the ways of thinking around that. And again, the International Resource Panel, and then translated also in the thinking at the EU level, is clearly focusing on that early stage of the value chain as well.
Yeah, fully evolving or effectively evolving away, as you mentioned, from a more territorial approach to a more value chain centered approach that recognizes the reality of the global scenario. Okay. Well, with that in mind on issue 2, then again, I want to come back to our audience for some questions which are jumping up on our screen. So we already have 2 up there that we can deal with together. Europe already acts to prevent carbon leakage. Should we also pay wider attention to biodiversity leakage? Something, in fact, we were discussing earlier today together, pollution leakage as part of the zero pollution agenda. So Hans, that's straight on your desk, that one, as a starting point.
Yeah, well, I think one of the evolutions which we see in the European Green Deal is indeed that there is that link with the external footprint that is starting to play a role. And we have the new forest strategy. That was launched a couple of weeks ago by Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans. And it makes reference to imports in Europe that have an impact on deforestation in, for example, Latin America, in Brazil and in other places. So we are slowly moving in that direction. which I think is the right direction, because I mean, if you want to be the beacon of sustainability, you cannot only reflect on in the narrow way, you need to reflect also on the external dimension.
Indeed, you mentioned yourself earlier about Europe as being a leader on this.
Yeah.
And in fact, to take that role of leader, it arguably would be necessary to have that in place. So, okay, we've seen, for example, in the forest strategy you mentioned, we've seen in the climate area, we have CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Is there? The question here, I think, is really asking you, are we going to? Is there going to be something similar in place for biodiversity leakage?
Well, forests are part of biodiversity, so that is a clear element.
Beyond the forest strategy.
We will see what comes out of the COP, the Conference of the Parties on the Biodiversity Convention, that is taking place in two rounds, one in Kunming and then the next round. We'll see whether that is part of the more economic and regulatory agenda. Let's see what comes out of that. Pollution leakage, I think that is already happening through standards in products. And partially it was embedded in REACH as well. But this could be extended. But taking responsibility for the external footprint is clearly a direction of travel.
Thomas, I see you want to come in there.
Yeah, well, you say CBAM, we have CBAM. We don't have CBAM yet. We're talking about CBAM. And it's
we have CBAM in theory, indeed. Yes.
So I support that. That needs to be in place as part of that. But we have to recognize that these things are not easy. As I said, we are thinking about it, and I think it is right, because otherwise it will be very hard to uphold your standards. But let's recognize these things are not easy, and will need careful design, need to be compatible with WTO rules, just to name one aspect. But I think even the sort of concept and the threat that we will go towards these mechanisms will lead to other parts of the world to take note and to see that they really have to take action along those lines. So I think we have to think about these things, but let's not oversimplify them. These are not slam dunks. It is now accepted that Europe will want to move in that direction for certain products, but we're not there yet.
So is that something you could agree with, Hans? Complex problems need complex solutions, so we mustn't oversimplify.
No.
But mechanisms like this do have a part to play?
Yes, absolutely. On complexity, I fully agree. There are no silver bullets to solve complex solutions, which means that we need to explain complexity to those who are making decisions, whether it's in the public sphere or the private sphere, in a way that facilitates and strengthens their capacity to make decisions. And that's where I think knowledge players like ourselves really have a role to play. And there is a saying that one should reduce complexity as much as possible, but not more than that.
Yeah, it's the Einsteinian principle, isn't it?
Yeah, so I don't believe in oversimplification. I believe in explaining complexity in a simple way, which is not the same thing, and that is the basis to deal with these issues.
And that is maybe, if I may, also caution a bit on just the notion zero pollution. I mean, I think as a concept, it is a simple concept. It is a clear concept. But the reality is that, totally zero pollution is probably for many industries not going to be achievable in our lifetime, at least.
Do you intend, if I can, Thomas, not achievable because it's simply not feasible?
Well, you cannot do metallurgy and mining just with clean air and pure water. I mean,
not with current available technology, indeed. Well, Hans, could we slay an elephant in the room here? Because I bring my perspective, obviously, as a communications person as well, and a moderator to this. Whenever I hear absolutisms, I'm concerned. I'm also a scientist and a geologist myself by training as well. I saved that one till now. But when I hear in scientific terms absolute statements like zero, Yeah? It does concern me sometimes, but again, if I've understood it correctly, the thinking behind the zero pollution strategy, the zero pollution idea, is not that zero is a feasible target, but if you aim high, you get good results. Is that a correct reading of it?
Well, first of all, the goal is to organize society, the chemicals that we use, the products that we use in such way that they pose minimal risk to the environment and to human health.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's hard to discuss with those two ambitions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we frame it as zero pollution, which indeed is a strong statement. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But by framing it in such way, I think the signal is that we are not aiming for gradual, marginal, little steps forward, but that we have an end goal there that will require ourselves to rethink systems, to really question some of the things that we are doing. And that is in line with this idea of we need to go to a transition.
Okay.
And when you talk about in the industry and sectors, you could say that the first batch of rules was please pollute less. Yeah. The second batch was please become more efficient.
Yeah.
The second or the third round now is please reinvent yourself, to put it in simple terms. And this is part of this drive to reinvent what we are doing. This is also translated now in clear targets for 2030. The zero pollution package is being translated, and those targets are not just chosen out of the blue. They are based on science. Mm-hmm. They are based on an analysis of trend lines that we see. They are based on an analysis of what we estimate better technology can bring. Mm-hmm. And of course, they need to be translated then in an economic context. And that's where typical governments and the European institutions also discuss with the sectors what is the target and how this can be reached.
Okay, so Thomas.
Well, I was glad to hear Hans say minimal risk because I think for us it's important that all the analysis remains risk-based and not purely hazard-based, because risk mm-hmm. is in the end what we need to minimize. So I think we agree on that. No, I think that you can discuss about the communication aspect and so sort of shift the thinking. We have to acknowledge, I think, that some industries are have more potential in the next 10 years for radical reinvention. The car industry is one of those. I mean, they've actually made a fantastic mindset switch, which I, for one, wouldn't have thought possible 4 or 5 years ago. I think the change that has happened there is massive and has enormous consequences, not only on the metals industry, on the battery industry, but it has tremendous consequences for the whole economy of the world. Other industries probably obviously need to think about breakthroughs as well, and it's not just about incrementalism, but certain industrial activities maybe have less prospects today of a radical reinvention.
Yeah, we can almost talk about still a role evolution potential, can't we?
So there's still also a role for incrementalism and for gradually pushing the boundaries. Obviously, I'm all for complete breakthroughs, and I think Umicore's strategy, for one, was built on a number of radical breakthroughs and paradigm shifts in the past 20 years, and that's part of our of who we are. But we need to remain realistic in certain instances. And we have to look at it holistically, because in certain cases, if we do like circular economy in Europe, it creates an industrial activity in Europe which has not zero impact today. It has a degree of impact. It has a lot of positive externalities, if I may use that word. It has a lot of positive impacts of not creating much bigger problems, risks, hazards in other parts of the world. But then one has to accept that there's a minimal impact here.
Yeah. On the risk part, of course, if you have the intrinsic hazard and then you've got the exposure, and then you've got the overall risk. I think a couple of first of all, science has evolved really quickly in those areas, and that talks about low doses, mixtures, those elements. The regulation that is out there, REACH, is the best regulation on the planet. Probably Europe is ahead of the game. It's gold standard, and yet we don't know much about most of the chemicals that we use in the economy. So updating that with a new revision of the regulation and updating that and integrating it in other objectives like zero pollution, and then looking at categories of chemicals, for example, that have certain characteristics that are not compatible with the broader objectives of sustainability is definitely a number of next steps that will be set. The other element is that we are also discussing more and more bio-based solutions in the chemical sector, and of course metals are a particular element there. But also that will revolutionize, I think, the chemical sector. Reinventing a sector that has taken a particular pathway and bringing it in line with overall objectives will be a challenge and will be difficult, but has to be part of the overall objectives. To put it bluntly, and it's not something that I've come up with, but the current molecules that we use, in the way that we use them, are not compatible with climate objectives, not with biodiversity, not with circularity, because they are often too complex to go to full circularity, and not with human health objectives. So we need to reinvent, and Europe is ahead there. We have the most innovative chemical sector in the world. So let's be the first ones that push the others also in that direction. And that has relevance for the metals and the non-ferrous metals as well, because there is a close combination between the two sectors.
I see your point, Hans, regarding this need, obviously, to push forward. But equally, Thomas, your point is also raised there that we need to be feasible about the way we do that as well. Right, keeping an eye on time, obviously, for ourselves and our audience and our topics too. A second question I want to broach very quickly, because we've already partly touched upon, about differentiating itself, Europe, with that responsible value chain from global EU mines to EU metals. But how can we do this if we can't compete on cost with, for example, China? And Thomas, I'll put that first to you. Do you see that as an issue?
Well, I think that in many areas, Europe is actually succeeding in doing that. So we don't have to be just defensive or see the dangers. Obviously, we have to see the dangers and the risks, but Europe, by and large, has a competitive industry because it has agreed as a society to be a pioneer on these issues, and it has created in many cases a competitive advantage because we were ahead of the curve, and the rest of the world is gradually following in that direction. Yep. Even taking China, Europe developed emission legislation for combustion engines many decades back, and when we started in this industry, catalytic converters, Europe and California were sort of the pioneers in that. But what we have seen is, and that emission legislation, I think 20 years ago in China was lagging Europe by 15 years. Today, China is immediately adopting European emission standards or something very, very close to that. So in many cases, good regulation can be an export product as well. But we need to actively engage, and we need not to be naive about it. It needs sometimes protective approaches or market access regulation. I mean, why did we succeed on emission control to become the standard? Because every car that has to be brought on the market in Europe needs to reach a certain level, whether it's produced in other parts of the world or whether it's produced in Europe itself. So we need to devise also regulatory strategies that underpin it. On the other hand, we don't have to be naive. Certain things we cannot do. We cannot impose on everyone, and then we have to weigh to what extent are we prepared to pay the price for being a pioneer, and what is reasonable and what is not reasonable.
Yeah, on a more normative topic maybe, but I think that is one of the roles of Europe in the next decades. We need to prove that democratic countries with open societies that have expectations of rule of law and transparency, and where human rights are the norm, and where we have also attention for social justice, that our type of system is capable of being in the lead and dealing with these challenges that we have for the next decades. Because as a true European Democrat, I refuse to accept that more authoritarian solutions or enlightened green dictatorship would be the way forward. Europe has a model, and we need to prove that this model is capable of being in the lead of the way forward.
And sustainably and feasibly at the same time. Now, I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. There's one other topic I want to very, very, very quickly touch upon, which we've already broached partially, which is the issue of financing and sustainable financing. I don't want to go into depth on it, thinking about time, and I want your conclusions in a moment, but just a brief comment from each of you about the role that financing and support for responsible growth also has to play in solving the zero pollution challenge. Thomas?
Well, I think that financing has been instrumental in recent years in forcing greater transparency on companies. It's not so much financing by banks but the whole capital markets approach. I think there's a tremendous rise of demand from investors, from retail investors for more sustainably labeled investment products, and this is being professionalized. In the past, there were a number of front runners, others were following, but and methodologies varied. Some were strict, some were more greenwashing, but this has been professionalized, and this is putting a lot of pressure on companies to actually become more transparent about targets, about their performance, and it has really led to a big push in recent years, certainly on listed corporations, on large multinationals, and I think finance has played a very big role in that transition in the last few years. So I think that's been a positive. I think that has a corollary that also financing for green project is generally available. It was also notable that it had a zero mark as a priority aspect or as a priority issue, availability of finance. I think for reasonable projects, finance is going to be around. So I think finance is actually playing its role in the system right now, and some of the European initiatives will further strengthen that. Again, we have to see that some of these don't go over the top in terms of becoming too bureaucratic, but overall, I think it is a factor for change, and that is actually partly driven by real consumer retail investor demand for sustainable finance.
And Hans, very briefly.
Yeah, to add to that, at the European level, it's of course a sustainable finance package that includes the taxonomy, climate taxonomy, green taxonomy, the European Investment Bank that is clearly profiling itself as a bank that wants to be at the forefront of that. We've got national banks and the European Central Bank that label themselves now climate banks. So in the financial system, I think that move is indeed quickly happening, and increasingly financial institutions send the message, look, there is no shortage of capital. We just need a pipeline of credible forward-looking projects, and we will finance them.
Okay, so the potential of the finance is there. It's now about creating targets for that finance to invest in. Okay, well, bringing our debate, we've covered a very wide range of topics in a 90 plus a few minutes there. Obviously on a very broad topic in tackling the zero pollution challenge. I want to bring things to a conclusion now for our audience and for our debate, just by giving the floor to each of you, Thomas and then Hans, very brief takeaway comments for our audience, for industry, and for all the other parts of our audience as well. So when it comes to my initial question about the Green Deal balancing Europe's need for significantly more key metals, massively increased demand, with the mitigation of its environmental impact as an industry, what would be the one or two key takeaways from you, Thomas, for our audience today?
Well, I think the key part is the metals industry is much more part of the solution than it's part of the problem. It is clearly part of the solution. It has a tremendous role to play. It will have to play a tremendous role, and it's by and large on track to do that. We have key enabling technologies. We have this massive advantage in terms of capability for circularity because of the intrinsic properties of metals. We have been on an incremental track for pollution reduction. I think we can, in certain cases, strive for breakthroughs. In other areas, we will need to continue for a while on the path of incrementalism. But I think the European industry is leading in many aspects, and does that because we participate in this ethos that Hans has outlined, and we see regulation as having an important part to play in that. What is important is obviously that this regulation remains both ambitious, but at the same time coherent and has a degree of realism in it as well. And so good interaction between regulators and industry remains crucial. I think that is what we've tried to do over the years, by and large, and that is where Eurometaux plays a very important role. And I think we want to continue on that track.
Thank you, Thomas. And Hans, I'll give the last word to you for some
Yeah,
summary.
3 short things. 1, there is no other option. I mean, science and knowledge are telling us that the boundary conditions of the 21st century are about climate, biodiversity, and resource use. So there is no other option. Secondly, we have with the Green Deal an ambitious project in Europe that allows, I think, us to speed up and scale up the solutions that are there and to put European economic actors at the forefront of where we need to be globally. And thirdly, I think that global connection is important also for the metals industry, because most of the economic value chains that we have now are global value chains. So reflecting on the responsibility that we have in that external dimension, I think is also a critical element of thinking of a more circular and sustainable future.
Thank you, Hans. So a very big thank you to our audience for joining us today. Thank you to Thomas and to Hans for your interventions and comments and discussion points, and you, our audience, for your questions. So with those summaries in mind, I'd like to bring today's debate to a close. Thank everybody for their attention, and I look forward to seeing how this very challenging topic, very multifaceted topic, evolves in the coming years. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.